Let's give it up for Cameron.
G'day Reefers, I'm Cameron the Fish Guy. And welcome to day 2 of ReefStock Australia. Thank you so much to ReefBuilders for putting on this tremendous event and inviting me to speak. So those of you who don't know me, I work at an aquarium store in Brisbane called Gallery Aquatica. And at Gallery Aquatica, we specialise in the sale of sustainably sourced marine fish and corals. And we also sell propagated corals and aquaculture fish. Now, my partner Anya's role within the business is all about managing the aquarium store, whereas my role within the business is about overseeing the installation of aquariums for our customers. And one of the key aspects of installing a reef aquarium is the aquascape. And so I'm commissioned to create aquascapes for a lot of my clients that are aesthetically pleasing and ecologically efficient. And so I've been doing this for 20 years, and in the 20 years that I've been creating these aquascapes, both for my personal tanks and for my clients, I've seen a real evolution in the philosophies, the systems and the products that we use to create these aquascapes. And I find it a really interesting topic. So today I'd like to talk to you about aquascaping epic reef tanks. This tank is actually a tank we put up on YouTube today. It's a beautifully aquascaped tank, and there's a lot of aspects of this tank which we'll talk about more as we look at some of the different philosophies with aquascaping. So why do we talk about scapes? So the aquascape is intrinsically linked to the beauty of the tank. We are effectively trying to create an aquascape which replicates what we would see on the reef environment. And in fact, we're often trying to create an aquascape which is better than what you would see on the actual reef. And so we try and create a scape which is designed to complement the corals and the fish that we are looking to keep in our tank. So, a brief history of reefscapes. So, in the time that I've been creating aquascapes, the type of scapes that we create has really changed. And when I first started creating aquascapes, reef tanks, 25 years ago, we were typically creating an aquascape which was effectively a wall of loose live rock piled up against the back of the tank. And it was effectively a detritus trap. It was a large footprint which didn't allow for good water flow around the tank. And so the types of corals that we were keeping in these tanks were generally soft corals and short-lived LPS. And back in the day, the LPS corals that we were putting in our tanks were really only living for a number of weeks or a number of months. They weren't really growing in the tank. And so effectively, the aquascapes that we were creating were like a shelf for cut flowers. So this is a scape that I would have created a number of years ago, and it is primarily soft corals, corallimorphs, daisy polyps, and these are the sorts of corals that we were able to keep based on the types of technology we had, but also based on the limitations that the aquascape would actually create. This is a good example of a wall scape. So what has changed? So in the last 20 years, our understanding of the importance of a number of parameters has really changed, and our ability to precisely monitor these parameters has changed. And phosphate is the classic example. We're now able to use HANA checkers to accurately monitor our phosphate, and our understanding of coral biology has also changed. So we know the importance of these parameters for these types of corals. But we also have access to technology which creates better water flow and better lighting. So the technology has also changed over the last 20 years. But aquascaping has become an art form. And in the same way as a sculpture will create, like an artist will create a sculpture, we can create a beautiful sculpture of an aquascape that you would drop into a tank. And so there's also artificial live rock, which is something we didn't have back in the day. And artificial live rock, and this is this is Anya's rip tank. And so artificial live rock makes it very easy to create these beautiful scapes because of the textures and the shapes that are available to us. And we have a number of products which are on the market to bind these scapes together. And so I typically will use products such as epoxy and reef cement, coral glue, and these things weren't really available to us back in the day. So this is an example of what I would consider to be a modern reef tank. You can tell because it's got lots of Apex gear and a Pomali acrylic sump, but the scape is very open. It allows for excellent water flow. It has lots of ledges, and this is a scape that we did specifically for SPS coral. So the modern aquascape has changed in a number of ways, but typically these days I will have a minimum amount of sand, and a lot of the tanks that we do these days will actually be bare bottom. And so this reduces the amount of detritus that builds up in the substrate. And so the scapes that we are creating are really designed to complement the light and the water flow. And so I would typically create an aquascape which allows the corals to be the centerpiece, and the corals themselves actually become the scape, the aquascape. And as I said before, they're often like a work of art, sculpture which is dropped in place in the tank. And something else I've put in here is the psychology of the fish, because I find this an interesting point, that certain fish have got requirements for what they need in a tank to feel happy and healthy. And so, for example, angelfish really like to have caves, and if your scape is such that it creates these sorts of environments for the fish, your fish will be happier and therefore healthier. So I use the term rules of aquascaping a bit tongue-in-cheek, because we're talking about something which really varies. The aesthetic appeal of an aquascape varies from person to person, and so what one person likes the look of is not necessarily the same as what other people will like. But when I'm creating an aquascape, I really like to try and ensure that I have a minimal footprint, and this, as I said, allows for minimum detritus to build up amongst dead spots at the base of the aquascape. I like the rock to be secure. So each piece of rock is going to be, in the scape that I create, will be epoxied to another or stone fixed, so that there's no loose rocks that can fall and crush corals. I like to allow for growth, because these days, now that we're able to have success with SPS corals and corals that will grow quite tall, I like to ensure that I've got sufficient space for the corals to grow. I say a flipper distance between the rock and the glass, but this is something to keep in mind. You need to ensure that you've got a sufficient space between the rock and the glass, that you're able to clean the glass and keep it free of algae. And a flipper distance is the minimum amount of space required to be able to do that. I like to ensure that the structures are safe from collapse and falling over. And so something I've started doing in the last few years is I actually use epoxy to create little feet on the base of the aquascape, so that it is stable and won't fall over. And something that I like to do, my aquascapes I like to be balanced but not symmetrical. Anya would talk about the rule of thirds, but I like it to effectively have a certain look. I don't like too much symmetry in a reef aquascape. So building your aquascape, the first thing I normally think about is what type of rock you're going to use. And I still work with live rock, but it's certainly gone out of favour in the last few years. People, of course, are worried about the introduction of pests and problem algae and such. So generally the scapes that we create are made out of base rock or artificial live rock. And I particularly like artificial live rock because I find it's very easy to create interesting structures. And the tank in the photo is a tank that we did a couple of years ago, and it's an interesting aquascape because it's a 6 feet by 3 feet wide tank with a central weir. And so this central weir has got lots of ugly plumbing and such, And so I had to cover this weir with rock. And the way I've done this is I've actually used epoxy, stone fix and artificial live rock to build up for a full 4 feet of depth so that you can't see into the weir. And it worked out really well. It goes against my rule of symmetry, but I had no choice but to cover this weir, and it certainly came out really well. I sat in this tank for 2 days straight, epoxying the rock into place, but it looks really good. So I also think about, are you going to build your aquascape in the tank or out of the tank? If you're creating it out of the tank and dropping it in place, then this is kind of only possible for certain size aquascapes, and I'll normally only do this for tanks up to 500 litres. But building in the tank is something that I do quite often these days, particularly with large tanks like this one. And the types of products I use for these sort of jobs: epoxy, stone fix, or reef cement, and coral glue. So this is how it turned out. I put some ledges in this tank so that it did sort of make it a little bit less symmetrical, and we've still done a lot more work since this footage was taken. So epoxy is my favourite product for creating aquascapes, and I think it's a product that if you're really looking at creating a nice aquascape, it's a good product to get familiar with, because it does take a little bit of practice. And so this is just a video of me creating an aquascape, and I basically like to knead the epoxy, roll little sausages and little balls, and I use this in a variety of ways. And certainly epoxy is a great product to create aquascapes. And so effectively I strategically choose positions in the rock work to use it. But it's good because you can use it underwater or out of water. You can use it from any sort of angle, which isn't really true of some of the other products. But epoxy is definitely my favourite thing to use. And some of these tanks which I've got, and you'll see SPLASHBACK Reef in a minute, I'll use 30 or 40 packets of this epoxy. So choose your structures for your tank. It's important that the structures you're putting in your tank complement the dimensions of the tank. And so the example on the screen is a tank which we did, which was 4 feet long by 1.5 feet wide by 80 centimetres tall. So it's a very tall tank. And so it was important that the aquascape for this tank was going to be quite tall, and the scape you can see is about 2 feet tall at the tallest point. And so we've used a combination of different structures. I like to call them rainbows, overhangs and bommies, crevasses and ledges. And so I think about the types of corals and the positions of the corals when I'm creating the scape. And so with this one here, the ledges on the left, I specifically had in mind for some Duncanopsamias which would branch out, but effectively the corals become an extension of the aquascape. So this is SPLASHBACK Reef, and SPLASHBACK Reef is a very interesting tank in that it is the splashback for a kitchen that you can see through on the other side, and the side that we're looking at is the butler's pantry. So it's actually a tank which is visible from both sides. The dimensions of this tank are 12 feet long by 2 feet wide by 4 feet high. It's a really tall tank, and it's really narrow, and the fact that it's visible from both sides, it's very important that the aquascape doesn't go too close to either edge. So we had to create a very narrow scape, and this is another tank that I sat in for a number of days to create each side of the scape. But because this tank is only able to be accessed from one side, I had to ensure that I was able to put corals on both at the front where I didn't have good access. So we've left that section in the middle so I can get in the tank and actually reach around to glue corals in place. It's also a very open scape, so it helps with the water flow. With a tall tank like this one, it is more difficult to create natural water flow or sufficient water flow. So I've left it quite open, and there's lots of positions for corals, and it's doing really well, this tank. And so when you're choosing the position of your corals in the tank, of course you need to ensure that you're giving your corals appropriate light and flow based on their requirements. But I also think about the shape of the corals and consider them to be an extension of the aquascape. And so the position of the corals really becomes the aquascape. Now, I will almost always use glue, but occasionally epoxy, to attach the corals into position. And you can see in the photo we've got an Acropora which is propped up by this skewer. And so I use a variety of tricks to actually glue the corals in place and allow them to stay in place whilst they're being glued. So this is Magic Mountains Reef, and this is probably one of the more popular tanks that we film. And it's a tank which I didn't do the initial aquascape, but I've glued in all the corals since. And you'll notice with the aquascape, it's two massive bommies. This tank is 4 feet tall as well, and the bommies, one of them is probably 3.5 feet tall. But it goes against my rule of minimal footprint. And unfortunately, we do struggle with phosphates in this tank for that reason. But it's a really interesting tank in that it's another tank that's only accessible from one side, and again I actually have to get in this tank to glue the corals in place. The other difficulty with this tank is that the sides of each of the bommy are very vertical, and so to ensure that every coral in the tank has got sufficient light, the position of each coral is particularly important. And so I have to ensure that there is nothing above shading the coral below. And I've also been very particular with the types of corals and the position in the tank that I put them. So you can see we have things like the LPS towards the bottom, the SBS at the top, and we've actually had a bit of a problem of late with the big Dallas at the top. It's starting to shade the corals below. So coral position with this tank is particularly important, but I've spent hours and hours and hours swimming in this tank, gluing corals in place, and the client is very particular about the positions. And if there's a coral that he wants to put in this spot over here, I'll have to reach around, and I've had some times where I've basically had to hold my breath for the whole time the glue has been drying, and it's a very nice tank, but it certainly has been a lot of work with the coral placement, but it is doing very, very well. So Acro Dream Tank. This is a tank that I would consider to be a more modern aquascape, in that the actual aquascape itself is relatively low in the tank. It probably goes up about halfway to the top of the tank. And the customer specifically wanted to have lots of stags reaching up for the surface, and it's worked out really well. The scape is low, but it's still very open, and there's lots of caves and swim-throughs, and this helps with the water flow, of course, but it certainly has allowed us to create a lot of, or to grow a lot of Acropora stags, and a lot of them are actually getting very close to the top of the tank. You can see we've got massive Dallas, there's some blue stag, the yellow at the front, and really the scape, whilst you don't see the rock work that much in this tank, the scape is really what makes it. And this tank runs at very low nutrients, it's got excellent water flow, there's a few LPS in there, you can see the frogs born at the bottom and such, but it's a particularly beautiful tank, and I think that's what I would consider to be a very modern aquascape. So, in conclusion, whilst it's true that that aquascaping is a very subjective sort of topic, if you follow a few basic rules such as the footprint and such, and you use products which are available, you can certainly create a very nice aquascape which is ecologically effective and aesthetically pleasing. So, are there any questions?
Ken, any first-hand what not to do for us?
What not to do? Don't put your foot on a diadema urchin, which I've done. What not to do? I mean, I just think that it's all about footprint. I think the footprint of the rock on the sand is such a big thing. If you've got, and you can counter a large footprint with strong flow, and this tank, whilst it has a large footprint, we've got some very, very strong flow, and that makes all the difference. But a minimal footprint for me is one of the key things, and just ensuring that the light complements us to the aquascape you're creating. Yes.
This splashback tank,
Yep.
is the heat from the cooking effect?
Good question. I've always said no. However, recently I was there and they were cooking, and I actually could see steam on the glass. And it doesn't seem to affect it, and I guess the volume of water passing around it doesn't actually allow the glass to heat up. The chiller, which is downstairs, never seems to struggle. So I'm going to say it doesn't affect it, but when I saw the steam on that, it was kind of making me think, I should maybe look more close at that, because we get asked that question all the time. Yes?
You were saying you use a fair bit of epoxy in the tanks where you're aquascaping them, but the one on Acro that I was reading yesterday, so it was only like use half a packet per 100 litres. Is there any concerns there about using too much?
No. And I guess that they're probably giving a guide for what they would suggest would be the amount that you would need to use. But it entirely depends on the structures you're creating. With epoxy, some people do find that when they're using it underwater, that they'll get a lot of frothing and the skim will over skim. I don't normally find that, but because I'm aware of it, I'll always be careful, and if I am using some epoxy in a tank, then I'll keep an eye on the skimmer, and if it does over skim, then I'll deal with that. But no, I don't think that there's any reason other than potential over skimming of the skimmer that would be a problem. I think most of the time when I do use massive amounts of epoxy, it's when I'm doing a scape which is dry. It's not very often I use a lot underwater. Yes?
If you're doing this stuff inside of the tank, on a bare bottom tank,
Yep.
are you not scared that it's going to fall on glass?
It's always a consideration. Typically when I'm doing a scape in the tank, I will pay particular attention to the rock work that I do towards the base of the scape, so that I know from the bottom up it is very secure. So it is certainly one of my greatest fears that a really tall scape will tumble, but I just ensure, and this is one of the reasons why I use so much products like the epoxy and stone fix, I just ensure that there's no way it can. And having the feet on the bottom is one of the key things, because if your base rock is wobbly, then of course that will increase the chances of everything coming down. But I've never had a major collapse like that, knock on wood, but certainly small collapses I've had, and there's nothing worse than when you've got a beautiful tank that everything's going well, that one rock falls, it hits another, and then you've lost a few corals and you've got to rebuild it. So that's why I'm really into strong, secure structures these days. Yes?
Do you find much of a difference between the Aqua you get from Bunnings?
I do. And I don't like it. But I think what it is more so is that I use the two little fishies epoxy almost exclusively these days, and I'm very used to the time it takes for it to set in the tank, and I find it's almost always very quick and easy to prepare. When I use the different ones, it's more a case of I'm not used to its set time or for whatever reason, but I think that you can certainly use it without problem, but for me, I think it's a little bit too slow to set, and I've always got a time frame that I'm working to, and if it's for your home aquarium, the Aqua probably isn't. I also like the coralline colour.
Yeah.
So.
What water flow rules or ratios do you use for your tank, Cam?
I don't use any rules when it comes to circulation within the tank, because I find that depending on the aquascape, how open it is, different tanks will require different amounts of in-tank circulation. But I do work on a rule for the turnover between the sump and the tank, which is, I always aim for a 10 times turnover. But I do have a lot of, so in other words, 10 times the turnover of the tank. So if you've got a 600 litre tank, your return pump should do 6,000 litres an hour. But even that, I do have a lot of tanks which run on significantly lower flow, and they still run fine. But that's my rule, 10 times. Yes?
When are you going to drop the board shorts and get into some speedos?
I forgot to bring one, sorry.
Costs extra.
Got a man doing
Thank you, everyone. So that's our video for today. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, hit the subscribe as well. We'll be putting out videos every week showing a new tank with new products. There's going to be lots in all the videos. I'm Cam the Fish Guy, and keep on reefing.